Today I'm presenting my paper Immigration, Parenthood, and Child Penalties. And as always, any comments are more than welcome and appreciated. So what's a bit of the motivation that I had behind this paper? So I mean, both gender and immigration have been in the core, let's say, of the economic and political agenda worldwide. In terms of gender disparities, we cannot deny that we have seen considerable progress in the last decades. However, when we look at the labor market, we observe that persistent gender gaps are still very significant and they remain. And what the literature has shown us is that, at least in developed countries, most of these remaining gaps are attributed to the unequal impact of parenthood on men and women. So we've had this bunch of papers documented in different countries that indeed these gender gaps are due to these so-called child penalties. And I think that we can all agree on this. We can agree on this fact, but it's not clear yet how can we address these uneven costs of parenting. So now that we know the problem, how can we, what can we do to tackle these disparities? Then if we turn to immigration instead, the debate is rather unsettled. So, I mean, after decades of research as well, we are not sure how or to what extent does immigration affect native workers. And there have been many papers that focus on trying to show whether there are any costs or not. And in this paper, instead, I focus on one of the potential benefits where I try to understand if immigration can reduce gender disparities in the labor market. And how, what I have in mind is specifically through its contribution to the supply of domestic services. So to answer this question, I focus in the Spanish migration boom. And as I will show you in a bit, it has a lot of the key components of these episodes give me like the ideal quasi-experimental setting to answer this question. So a bit of background. When we compare Spain, for instance, to other typical destinations of immigrants, if we compare Spain to the US, to the UK and France, none of these countries had ever experienced such a sudden and large inflow of immigrants in such a very short span period of time. So here I'm comparing these four countries, and we can see that in Spain, for instance, from the 2000s, we have this sudden arrival of immigrants from different parts of the world. In less than 10 years, the share of workers foreign-born jumped from 3% to more than 14%. That's very large. And none of, as I said before, if we look at the US, if we look at the UK, none of them had ever experienced such a sudden shock, let's say. And now what matters for me is that we have this large arrival of immigrants, and many of them, actually about half of them, were women. And an important share of them were actually working as in the domestic and care service sector. So at the same time, we can see a very sharp increase, let's say, in the number of workers in domestic services and working as caregivers. In less than 10 years, the number of these workers almost doubled. And if we look at the difference between natives and immigrants, we can see that this increase is mainly driven by the arrival of foreign women, whereas the number of natives working in these sectors remains relatively stable. So now if we go back to the international scenario, let's say none of these countries, like we know that it's quite common to have foreign-born workers sorting into these services. But the thing is that none of them are so important, let's say, or sort so intensively as in Spain. So again, for instance, if we look at the US or if we look at Germany, we can see that the share of foreign-born employment working in domestic or in private households is not more than 2%. In Spain, it was more than 10% of immigrant workers were in this sector. And this is including men and women, but if we just focus on female immigrants, 1/3 of them were working in domestic and the care sector. So, I mean, we have a special context for many reasons. And then what is also useful is that these women that were arriving were geographically dispersed, let's say. So I have enough geographic heterogeneity. And what I will do, as I'll show you shortly, is I exploit both this time and regional variation as identification for the causal effect. Okay, so in a nutshell, what does this paper do? What I want to understand is whether an expansion of household services can reduce the child penalty in the labor market. To do so, I focus on the Spanish immigration boom. I use as identification a difference in differences strategy combined with an IV design. And what I will find, I'll show you that there is a reduction indeed in the child penalties for native workers. The results are driven mostly by a positive effect on women earnings with almost little or no effect for men. And this is concentrated among lower skilled mothers. When I look at the mechanisms, I see that the responses are not just driven by labor supply, but actually I see some relevant improvements in terms of job quality and job mobility. So what are the main contributions to my my research? I would say that first, of course, it contributes to the literature on gender economics and child penalty. As I will show you shortly, what I do is I propose a new measure, let's say, of the child penalty at the individual level. And why is this relevant? Because it allows me to use it as an outcome. That is, I mean, let's say my marvel of interest. And what I do is I exploit longitudinal information of all workers, both parents and non-parents, to construct an imputation-based individual counterfactual for each worker. Then in terms of the migration literature, of course, there's a contribution to the general literature that has studied the impact of immigration on local labor markets. In my case, I do an individual level analysis rather than just looking at aggregate regions, and I do so for men and for women. And this allows me to take into account a lot of individual heterogeneity that cannot be considered many times in a regional design, let's say. And then, of course, it contributes to the literature on the effect of migration on women. There have been some related studies that look at what happened at the relationship, let's say, between female foreign domestic workers and women native outcomes. But most of these studies have focused on female labor supply. I think I go one step farther, let's say, in the sense that I look at child penalties, I look at what happens in terms of job quality. And unlike other studies, I'm able to do this because I have very rich administrative data that allows me to explore directly the effects on parenthood costs. Okay, so what's the data that I use in general? So I exploit data from 1994 to 2008. So this shock started about in the 2000s, in the early 2000s. So I have data before and after the boom began. I use data from the continuous sample of working life. So this is a panel of match employer-employee social security records. And I will use this to build the labor market outcomes for natives. And the nice thing about this data set is that it also allows me to have like a clear identification, let's say, of the family composition, because each worker, I have information for, let's say for each worker, I have information for all the cohabitants and their exact date of birth. So I know exactly when a parent became a parent. And then the other main data set that I use is the local registry, or it's also called Padrón Continuo Municipal. So these are population records. This is not a sample. That basically every resident, let's say, in any municipality in Spain can register into. And the nice thing is that what is useful for me and why I use these records to build immigration shock is because in Spain, registration allows, guarantees access to public health and to education regardless of legal status. So let's say the police cannot use these records for deportation purposes. So at the end, it's like there is an incentive for immigrants to be registered there if you want to access these public services. And in addition to that, if you wanted to be eligible, let's say, for some of the amnesties that took place over time, like since the 90s, and the biggest ones late in the 2000s, you had to prove that you were living in Spain. And the way to prove that was to be registered in the municipality. So there were several, let's say, incentives, and that alleviates many concerns of measurement error when it comes to constructing, let's say, migration shares, especially because many of these workers were, let's say, undocumented. So they are not visible in the Social Security records, for instance, because they are not working in the formal labor market. And then in terms of local labor markets, what I do is I take this information that I have at the municipality, because I observe municipalities both for the immigrants, let's say, and I also observe the municipalities where the natives are living and where the natives are working. And I built this measure of local labor markets based on urban areas. So at the end, I construct 126 areas defined by the Spain's Ministry of Housing in 2008. So I also expand there in the sense that some studies in Spain just look directly at the province. That's a bit more aggregate. I try to look more, let's say, define much finer local labor markets. Oh, sorry, I cannot. Next, yeah. So what's the plan for today? I will show you briefly how do I measure these child penalties at the individual level, and then I'll go with the empirical strategy, what are the main results, who benefits, and what are the mechanisms. So when I built this outcome, what I had in mind is, okay, I want to know what's the effect of immigration on child penalties. And that means that I need to have the child penalty in the left-hand side. If we go back to all the child penalty literature, basically what we have is an estimate. So we have an average effect, which is the penalty, which is the coefficient associated to the timing of birth. So you have it basically in the right-hand side. And to build this outcome, and in general, my design, the other thing that I had in mind is, well, that I have these two time dimensions. So first, I have the timing of birth. So I know that I can see workers before and after having the child, and I know that as time goes by, the children is getting older, right? And they have more years of parenthood, let's say. But I also have the timing of the immigration shock, and this timing is continuous and increases over time. So basically what I did is I made a choice between these two, and I decided to exploit the timing of immigration shock and to look at parents 1 to 5 years after the birth of the first child. And I think that this will become clearer in 2 slides. What's this individual child penalty that I'm thinking about? And in the presentation, I will talk about child penalty and parenthood penalty like indistinctly. But the key question that I had in mind was, okay, many of this literature looks at what happens before and after. But I was thinking, okay, but what would be the earnings trajectory in the absence of kids? So not just what happened before you had that kid, but what would be this counterfactual, let's say, if you never had this first kid? So to do this, I use this imputation-based individual counterfactual approach inspired by what Borusek is doing now and co-authors in the event study literature. So to give you an intuition, what's the idea? I have many workers in my sample. I will classify them into treated. Treated are those workers that have had their first child already. And untreated are those workers that do not have any child yet, let's say. So here I'm talking about treatment in terms of having a kid or not. And then separately for men and for women, I first take the untreated observations. So this means that I look at everyone that doesn't have a kid or that doesn't have a kid yet. And I estimate this kind of, it's similar to it's not exactly a means regression in the sense that I just have age and interactions of age with education, so that captures life cycle patterns. I also have time fixed effects to make sure that I can capture business cycle trends. And then what I include here are the individual fixed effects. And the idea is, that I can acknowledge, or that I am aware that workers might have heterogeneous income profiles, and that they will be basically timing their fertility decisions depending on their preferences. And I think that this, I mean, not a lot of the literature has paid enough attention to this, but the idea of including these individual fixed effects is that you have your own trajectory, let's say, that to some extent control for your preferences of fertility and timing of fertility, let's say. So I estimate this, I estimate the earnings for these untreated observations. So I get an estimate, let's say, for all these parameters, for the individual fixed effect parameter, and then also for the covariates and the time fixed effect associated parameter. And then using this for each treated observation, I predicted counterfactual earnings by calculating basically the fitted values, let's say, of this regression. So what is key here is that in order to build this counterfactual, I need to observe the worker before and after she had a kid or he had a kid, because that's the only way that I can recover their individual fixed effects from the untreated sample, let's say. And then I define the parenthood earnings penalty as the difference between the actual earnings, what I observe, and this counterfactual. And for matters of interpretation, I just normalize it by the counterfactual as well. So basically what I'm looking is how much earnings are growing or decreasing with respect to this counterfactual trajectory for each worker over time. And I call this the parenthood penalty. So I call it penalty, but I mean, we can think about an actual penalty whenever this measure is below 0. We could think about a premium if this measure was above 1, right? So if this measure is higher, we can think about a decrease in the child penalties because basically you have a positive number in the numerator, let's say. So then what I do is I see how this parenthood earnings penalty compare between men and women. And I compare this outcome by gender. I look at mothers, I look at fathers, and I can see that the distributions do differ, that mothers have this right skewed distribution compared to fathers, which is basically showing that mothers are more likely to experience a penalty because there's a larger concentration below 0. And then I do a similar exercise, considering that, well, I want to make sure that I'm capturing penalties and not just that mother earnings are systematically underestimated. So I do the same exercise for a sample of non-mothers. So this would be like an artificial penalty, let's say, where I compare their earnings with respect to these fitted values. But I see the same result. And again, I see that mothers are the ones that are experiencing the penalty. When I look at other women, of course, there's no penalty. So this makes me feel a bit more, some reassurance about what I'm really capturing with this measure. Okay, so this is the outcome. Then what's the empirical strategy? So as I said before, I use a difference in differences framework where I'm really exploiting the timing of the migration shock. So as an outcome, I have my penalty. And then as explanatory variable, I have, of course, this would be the migration from female immigrants that are from specific origin groups, which are more likely to sort into the domestic sector. And then I have this interaction with gender. And I control for pre-birth characteristics. So these include age, education, experience, and two-digit industry before these workers became parents. And then, of course, I have this, I have the, well, gender and gender-specific time trends and also gender times area fixed effects.
María, just a clarification question from the Q&A.
Yeah.
Laura asked whether your outcome is estimated within industry or firm.
No, not really. Yeah. Thank you. No, so the idea is that when I was constructing the outcome is ideally you don't want to have any endogenous variable. So you don't want any variable that might change because of parenthood. And for instance, experience could change. That's why it's not there. It's just age. And it's the same case with industry and occupation. So women might, or men, let's say, might respond. Well, they might sort into different industries or occupations after parenthood. So that would be an endogenous variable. That's why I don't include it in the construction of the penalty. Thank you. Okay, so I have this diff in diff setting. And what I do is I choose mothers and fathers that are between 25 to 50 years old and that had their first kid 1 to 5 years before this calendar time T. So basically parents whose first child is between 1 to 5 years old. And in terms of labor force attachment, I look at workers that were already observed before 1999, so before the migration boom started, and that are observed at least 4 years after. So I don't want workers that are just joining the labor force, let's say, because of the migration boom, but rather workers that were already in the labor market. And for identification, what I do is, I mean, of course, I have this definitive setting, but the problem is that we know that these migration shares might not be truly exogenous, right? So migrants are choosing locations where probably there are more favorable conditions. And to address that concern, what I do is I use a shift share past settlement instrument. Again, restricting to the top origin countries that are the ones that I care about. So from workers that are sorting into the domestic service. And something that is key here is that I normalize both immigration inflows and the instrument by population in 1999. And this is relevant to address, let's say, endogeneity concerns that might arise if natives, let's say, are moving in or out these local labor markets because of the arrival of immigrants. So the normalization is relevant. As I said before, what's the advantage that I have here, that I have a sudden shock and that I have a clear change in the origin composition? So that makes, let's say, a strong case for this shift share past settlement instrument. So just in the spirit of time, I will skip briefly the first stage, but I can show you that, I mean, the instrument is relevant. This would be the actual versus the predicted female immigrant share. So, I mean, it satisfies the relevance condition. And I will jump into the results. Okay, so what's the effect on child penalties on the gender gap? So here I have, I compared the OLS to the IV estimates, and I'll look at the effect on mothers, on fathers, and on the gender gap for fathers and for mothers. So what I observe is that I see that a 10 percentage point increase in the share of female immigrants is associated with an average increase in earnings of mothers by 4.7%. And I do the exercise removing area fixed effects and removing the time since childbirth control that I put at the beginning. I also add regional controls. And I also include gender specific controls. So I interact all the controls that I mentioned before by gender, and the results seem to be quite robust. And when we look at fathers instead, there's not much of an effect. In fact, the effect is very close to 0, and it's not statistically significant. And that translates basically into a decline in this gap associated to parenthood costs of 5.5 percentage points. So we can say that a 10 percentage point increase in the share of female immigrants decreased these penalties on average by 29 So this is, let's say, the general framework. Now, what we want to make sure is that these effects are not driven by ongoing pre-existing trends in the labor market. So to address this potential problem and also to make a strong case for the parallel trends assumption, especially because I'm in a continuous setting, I estimate the following equation year by year, which is similar to the equation that I had before. I have the outcome, which is this parenthood penalty in the left-hand side, which is explained by the migration shock and an interaction times gender. So beta 1 would give me the effect for women, beta 2 the effect for men, sorry, beta 1 plus beta 2 the effect for men, and beta 2 the change in the penalty. And I run this for every year in a sense that if I look at the effect before 1999, I'm able to evaluate pre-trends. And if I look what happens after 99, I have an idea of what's the dynamics of the effect. So these are the results for the gender gap. And as you can see, there are no clear pre-trends that are driving the results. And moreover, the effects are not statistically different from zero. So we can make sure that there are no, I mean, the outcome was not correlated, let's say, with pre-existing conditions before the migration shock started. And we can see that the effect starts to become stronger by the mid of the 2000s. And this is interesting because this precisely, like, we can think about the migration shock in, let's say, two big episodes. So at the beginning, we had the arrival of many people from Latin America. And then over time, as I showed you before, more people came arriving. And in 2004 and then 2007, we have the two enlargements of the European Union. And that's when many people arrive also from the East. So that's consistent, let's say, with the timing of the effects that I observe. Now, when I split by gender, consistent with what I had before, I can see that the effect is mostly driven by mothers who are having a positive effect, let's say, on earnings or on this parenthood penalty. So a positive means that the penalty is dropping. And I see almost no effect for men. And again, I repeat the exercise in the short term. I look at what happened when, let's say, 1 to 5 years after childbirth, 1 to 3 years after childbirth. And I see again that there are no pre-existing trends and the effects seem to be a bit larger, but of similar magnitude for younger parents. Okay, so then in terms of heterogeneity, the question is, well, who benefits from this shock and how? So first, I start by looking what happens in terms of education. I split, I look at secondary education versus tertiary education. And again, I see for secondary that the effect is driven by mothers, and I see a positive and large effect, almost no effect for men. And instead, I see little response of those that are in tertiary education. And this kind of makes sense if we think that if there was a decline of prices, let's say, those that should actually be responding are families that are in the margin. So families that before the shock could not afford these services because these services already existed in Spain. But once you have this arrival of domestic workers that are often working below the minimum wage, you should see those that are benefiting for these lower prices are those that are relatively more resource constrained, let's say, and that's what I find. And then I look at other alternative skill definitions. So I look at whether they are, let's say, high or low skill based on how much they were earning before the shock. So I look at what happened to workers that are below and above the median income. Also, what happens in terms of occupational skill. So in Spain, there are 10 categories. I look what happens to, I split it in 5. So those that are high skilled are, for instance, engineers, college graduates, and those that are low skilled are, for instance, subordinates or non-skilled laborers. And I find the same results. So I find that, again, there's a positive effect for mothers. The mothers that are benefiting are those that are relatively lower skilled, either by education, income, or occupation, almost no effect for men. And that translates into a decrease in this parenthood penalty gap.
Maria, you have 10 minutes left.
Perfect, thank you. And then in terms of mechanisms, we can think, I mean, what are the two main channels that could drive this response? It could be either labor supply. So of course, an increased provision of domestic services might allow mothers to return to the labor force sooner. But it could also be job quality. So the idea is that if mothers have fewer time constraints, they might be able to, let's say, seize opportunities or find like jobs that are more aligned with their ambitions of professional growth, or that align better with their competencies, let's say, rather than settling for jobs that are just accommodating to their caregiving responsibilities. So it's a bit of this idea that he had of, or that Claudia Goldin talks about, okay, whether workers can grasp these greedy jobs or not. So in terms of labor supply, I find I will go a bit quick over this because of time. So I do find a positive response in terms of employment, not much in terms of whether women are working part-time or full-time. And I see that the effect is larger for during the first 3 years. So that's why I think that mothers are basically returning earlier to the labor force. And the effect again is concentrated among those that were relatively lower skilled. Then in terms of days of work, I also see that on average, women seem to be, well, mothers seem to be working 0.6 days, extra days per month. So that's about 2.3% of the average. And then in terms of job quality, I look at 3 different measures. So first, I look at what's happening with daily earnings, and I do see a positive response. So basically, I see that a 10 percentage point increase in the share of female immigrants is associated with a 2% to 3% daily increase in daily, this should be earnings per month. And then what I look is, okay, what's a bit of them? What are the attributes of these jobs? So first, what I look at the average or leave one out average of log daily earnings in the job where they are, in terms of occupation and sector, and in terms of firms. And I see a positive response for mothers who seem to be sorting into sectors and occupations that tend to pay more. And I see almost no effect for men. And for firms, I see a larger, much larger, 10 times larger coefficient for mothers versus almost no effect for men. However, this is not statistically significant. And then what I do is I try to decompose or see what happens in terms of job mobility. So I construct another, let's say, a proxy of job quality by using a movers design. So this is similar to this AKM framework. The only thing is that instead of looking at the firm component, what I obtain is an occupation and sector component. And I basically classify the fixed effects that I obtain in this case in percentiles, and I define whether women are, or well, men and women are upgrading if they are in a job that is in a higher percentile in terms of this estimated occupation sector component. I see whether they are in the same or whether they are downgrading. And what I find, at least for mothers, is that they are more likely to upgrade. This upgrade is more evident after 5 years, whereas the effect is much smaller at the beginning. So this kind of makes sense. We can think that this job quality or these mobility decisions take more time to materialize than just the labor supply response that was clear at the first years after childbirth. And then I have a bunch of robustness. I see what happens if I remove workers that are more exposed to the shock, what happens with different sample restrictions. I also have an alternative design. But in the 3 minutes that I have left, maybe I will go briefly into one of my favorite, that is that I do a matching difference in differences design. So the idea is, instead of having this counterfactual that has some, of course, parametric fractional forms assumptions behind, I use a near neighbor matching with a sample of parents that have not become, sample of workers that haven't become parents yet. And for instance, when I compare after the matching, the men and women who are non-parents and parents, again, I see that the penalty is evident for mothers, not much for men, which is consistent with the literature. And then apart from calculating a new measure of the penalty, and I mean, in the paper, you can see that the results are robust. I also compare what's happening to parents versus non-parents. Because the idea is that maybe, I mean, we are not sure if this effect of domestic services is just benefiting mothers, or if it's a benefit for women in general. So I compare women who are parents, so mothers, and women who are non-parents. And I see that there's a positive effect for mothers, but not much of an effect for women that have not, that do not have any kid. I don't know if this is, yeah. And then for men, once I control for earnings at baseline, I see almost no effect, at least not as large as the one that I observe for women. Okay. Yeah, so just to conclude, what I do in this paper is I exploit the Spanish migration boom to analyze the impact of an increased availability of domestic services on parenthood costs. I find that access to household production substitutes does reduce the gender disparities related to parenthood in the labor market. I find that this reduction is driven by a positive effect on earnings for women who are living in more exposed regions, almost no effect for men. And I see that the effect is more pronounced for relatively lower skilled mothers. What are the mechanisms? I see that both labor supply and job quality seem to be driving the responses. There is some suggestive evidence of workers sorting into higher paying firms, but especially sorting into better occupation, let's say, and occupations and sectors, let's say. And I also see that over time, there's more mobility to better jobs. And in terms of policy implications, well, we can see that this availability of substitutes for household production might help not just address these gender gaps in general, but also reduce within gender disparities by helping women that are potentially in the lower part of the skill and income distribution. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria, for your great presentation. I suggest we continue with the discussion by Emir, and then we'll open I see some hands that are raising now. We'll open the discussion afterwards, after the discussion, by the discussant, I mean. Emir, the floor is yours. You can share your screen.
Thank you. Stop.
Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you to the organizers for giving me a chance to discuss this great paper. I really learned a lot from reading it. And I'm just gonna jump right into it. So this paper is motivated by the question, do immigrants reduce the gender gap in child penalties? And the key insight, the mechanism that's going to drive these results is going to be that an increase in immigration can lead to cheaper domestic and childcare services, because especially female immigrants are more likely to sort into these occupations. And availability of cheaper domestic services can then decrease the child penalty, especially for women, because after giving birth, women can take advantage of these cheaper domestic services to continue with their careers. And the paper studies the Spanish migration boom to document the impacts of arrival of female immigrants on the child penalty for both men and women. And it exploits the networks of past immigrant settlements for identification and compares the shift share design with a definitive design to have causal effects. The main results of the paper is that increase in female migration leads to a significantly lower child penalty for women. And this leads to about a 29% decrease reduction in the gender gap in the child penalty for a 10 percentage points increase in the share of female migrants. And these effects are heterogeneous, and they're especially concentrated on less skilled and less educated and lower earning women. And this drop in, and finally, the paper shows that the drop in child penalty is driven by both higher labor supply, but also interestingly, increased job quality for new mothers. As I see it, the key contributions of this paper is, first of all, it focuses on child penalty as a labor market outcome that immigration can affect. And this is a novel outcome that is obviously very important in thinking about labor market gaps between men and women. And it creates a new measurement of child penalty at the individual level using an imputation method that allows Maria to do analysis that without this method would not be possible to do. So this is a novel measurement. It's also interesting that impacts are primarily on low-skilled women, because in this literature, usually, I think people find that the effects of increased immigration primarily affects the labor market outcomes of high-skilled women. But in the context of child penalty, Maria shows that actually this pattern is reversed and the effects are concentrated on low-skilled women who might be at the margin when deciding whether they're going to buy, whether they're going to use domestic services or not. And finally, the paper just has very detailed administrative data, combines it with identification that combines both the shift share design and a definitive design, and overall this leads to a very convincing analysis. So I think, in short, the paper asks a really important question. The analysis is really convincing. I mean, Maria's presentation already showed the main results, but there's also way more robustness and alternative event and study designs, et cetera, than you might think. And all the results sort of point the same direction. So I think the results are very convincing. And finally, it's a very well-written paper, and I really enjoyed reading it. And the comments to come is sort of going to reflect the fact that I've been convinced by the analysis enough that I think my comments are going to be sort of on the more minor side, even though I'm not going to constantly call everything a minor comment. So the first comment I want to make is, I think with this really cool measure of individual level child penalty estimates, Maria can do more, you can do more with characterizing who actually has high versus low parenthood penalty before going into the causal effects or anything. Especially, I think it will be interesting to see how this differs between high and low skilled women. Because in the paper, we see low skilled women experience a larger drop in parenthood penalty. And the explanation given is that high skilled women who are relatively richer can likely already afford childcare, and therefore the immigrant shock primarily affects lower skilled women who are at the margin. If you, for example, show that in the baseline, the parenthood penalty is larger for less educated women versus more, this might be an additional piece of evidence that's supportive of this, right? But this is just one measure of heterogeneity, but I think you can do just much more about just showing us descriptors on the parenthood penalty. And if there's indeed a skill income gap in the parenthood penalty, even within women, then your paper also shows that this gap, the skill gap in women's parenthood penalty, might be closing with immigration, which would be, I think, a novel finding. A quick second point about the parenthood penalty measure is that one thing that surprised me is that for women, about 30% of the mass in the parenthood penalty estimates are actually positive, which seems to suggest that there's a parenthood premium. And I guess this really went against my prior, so I think some discussion of why this might be the case, given how novel and important this measure is for you, can be useful. I mean, this might just be statistical noise, of course, or maybe this is consistent with previous findings. There are some people who we might expect there's like an increase in earnings after they have after they have a child. I just didn't exactly know how to think about this positive mass. And given you have individual predictions for each individual in your data, you can also probably get some sort of confidence intervals for these predictions to quantify the uncertainty. And maybe, who knows, like the more positive, like the larger parenthood penalty are for people for statistical reasons we have higher uncertainty for, right? I think some more to do there might be useful. Very minor comment. Another thing that also jumped out at me when I first saw this measure is the lack of mass at -1, because I expected that after having a child, a large portion of mothers may actually just drop out of the labor market, their income goes to zero. second reading of the paper, I realized that this measure is only for women who are working, and in the appendix, there's the figure for all women. I would suggest maybe move the all women figure to the paper, because I think it's a striking and very important figure, and not everybody might go to the appendix, and I think they might be confused like I was. So the paper's focus is on female migrant stock, understandably, because they're the ones who sort into domestic and caregiving occupations. I was wondering if it is possible to show that male migrants actually do not lower child penalties, almost maybe as some sort of placebo check. Obviously, this is dependent on whether there's spatial variation between share of male and female migrants within a region. If these things are perfectly collinear, not much you can do here. It's hard to separately identify these. But if there is variation, at the very least, you can try to see if controlling for the share of foreign-born working age men in the population makes a difference. And maybe after the market, when you have time, you may start thinking about like whether it would be possible to create like a gender-specific shift share instrument. If, for example, different source countries tend to send more men versus migrant women, just to see if the male migrant stock doesn't have an effect on this Parenthood penalty. I think it would be very convincing if there's like a sort of a well estimated zero on the male migrant side. So when we're talking about the mechanisms, when we're talking about the labor supply, daily earnings, and occupations of new mothers, when I was reading the paper, my initial thought was, is this only specific to new mothers, or is this possibly driven by just like general labor market effects of immigration on all women? And I thought a triple difference specification, where you're also using the difference between new mothers versus not, can be informative about this. And you can construct this control group following the matching design in section 6. I thought that might work. Again, apologies. When I was looking at the paper right before the presentation, I actually realized you're maybe doing something like this. You also talk about it in your presentation. But it is only one sentence at the end of like a robustness section. And so I'm sorry that it's great that you already thought about this. I think it might be useful to do like a more detailed analysis of this, where you're looking at all the mechanisms specifically and actually discuss it in the paper when you're talking about the mechanisms, because the less attentive reader may just read that section, thinks this issue is unaddressed, and miss that one sentence at the robustness. I think this is a very important analysis that you're apparently already doing. So I think it would be good to showcase it a bit more. A few minor small comments. I was just wondering if there's any way to show a direct evidence on either price or consumption of childcare services, given this is sort of what you think are driving the results. I assume data availability is an issue here and you're not doing it, but I just wanted to point it. Like maybe there are time use surveys where you can see how much women spend personally taking care of their children. Maybe labor force surveys can give you something about how much domestic helpers make, something like that, but I don't know if the data exists. Another thing was in the main analysis, it suggests there's no real impact on the parenthood penalty or earnings of new fathers, while the individual analysis you do in the robustness and extension sections shows that fathers with young children actually see a bit of a significant and persistent increase, as you can see here in the blue bars. I was just trying to wrap my head around, does this imply there's maybe a compositional effect that's operational for fathers, that's not for mothers? I think just discussing this a little bit, why the results differ between the two types of analysis might be useful. And final comment, the version of there was one selection story that was at the back of my mind when I was reading this paper, which is higher competition with immigrants may lead to women with lower labor force attachment drop out before having children. And therefore, then you are seeing the childhood penalty primarily for women who, because of selection, had higher labor force attachment to begin with, which can mechanically maybe give like a higher parenthood penalty. There's a good chance the sample restrictions you do actually sort of rules this out. And if that's the case, I think some discussion of that might be useful, because much of the selection discussion in the paper is actually about selection that's going the other way, where labor market competition is actually pushing lower skilled native women into higher paying jobs. But this is another explanation. Plus, you have the data, I think, to get at this directly. You can see if it is possible to show the immigrant boom does not predict changes in labor force participation within your sample. And if the effect is null, then the selection thing is not a concern. These are my comments. Again, I think it's a very well written paper. Congratulations, and I learned a lot from it.
Thank you, Emir. Maybe Maria, if you want to answer in like 1 or 2 minutes some of the points, I mean, you can choose. And then we open the discussion to other participants. I see that we have already 2 questions. So yeah, if you want to answer a few points.
Thanks a lot, Amir, for the discussion, and these comments are super useful. So, I mean, most of them are suggestions also in terms of how, I mean, a couple of things that I think that I could do after some months. But also in terms of the organization of the paper, I agree, because there are some nice results that I like, also like the matching one, that I agree that it might go on like not noticed, unnoticed, let's say, in the paper. So yeah, I think that, I mean, I don't have much to say now. Thanks for the suggestions, because these are things that I can implement and I can try. And then maybe we can open the floor for other questions.
Okay, then we can start with Martin. Allow you to speak.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I was a bit puzzled by the dynamics of the results, because I was expecting if childcare was the mechanism, this would be driven by migrants who speak Spanish, right? So this would be a natural way to split the sample, right? So heterogeneity by the origin, the language of the migrants. And then I think that there is, I mean, I think your supervisor is Jesus, right? So he has worked on the white flight, right? So I think this is a completely plausible mechanism, that if migrants arrive, maybe these couples decide to relocate elsewhere, and then that allows women to access better jobs. And finally, maybe something that, I mean, maybe is, I know that you want to focus on the impact on natives, but at the end of the day, if you have, we care about society as a whole. So if you have all these migrants coming in, I don't know if you can have any idea of what is happening to child penalties overall in society, because particularly migrant women may be the ones who experience the largest penalties. So I'm a bit puzzled. So, okay, native women are better off. What is happening overall?
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Martin, for the comments and the questions. So in terms of the origin of the migrants, actually, I mean, well, I don't know if I'll share the slides again, but I have it in the appendix, that when you look at where these, who are the migrants that are working in the domestic sector, you have that the first group at the beginning, let's say 2003, it was people from Ecuador. So people that came to Spain escaping the crisis in the early 2000s. But then the second largest group are actually people from Romania. So in that sense, it's actually both people from Latin America and from the east of Europe that tend to provide these services. And I think that explains kind of the dynamics of the shock. First, that you have more people that are arriving over time, because the shock is continuous and it keeps increasing. And then the fact that in the mid 2000s, you have even more people arriving from the east, and these people are indeed working in the domestic sector. But having said that, I agree that it might also be interesting to see whether there's any heterogeneity in terms of language. And just one more thing in terms of language, that it's interesting because actually, given the Latin roots of the Romanian language, it's also actually very easy for them, and many of them speak Spanish too, or learn quickly. Then in terms of the white flight and the compositional potential issues, I agree that that's something to be like very, very careful about. And I didn't show it now, but Emir showed it in the discussion. But then I have an alternative design in the robustness, where instead of just checking at whatever worker is at that time in the local labor market, I set a fixed sample of workers in 1999. And I follow these very same workers over time. So I think that to some extent that addresses those concerns. And you can see again that the effect is significant for mothers, but you don't see much of an effect for those that didn't have kids, young kids in the baseline, let's say in 1999. And then in terms of what are the implications, I agree with that, and that's a very good point. And I actually have that in my research statement, because I think that that's something interesting to look afterwards. Definitely, like what's the other side of the coin? What's happening with immigrants? I'm not sure if they're experiencing much of a child penalty, in the sense that many of these migrants were coming exclusively to work. But the other question is what's happening. I don't know if there are any effects on their, I don't know, children outcomes, or in general, as you said, in terms of welfare, what's kind of the correct policy design, or like the best scheme that we can think of, because of course, this kind of worked because many immigrants were working in the informal sector, but you cannot scale that. And this implies that many immigrants were kind of underpaid potentially for their jobs. Yeah, I don't know, Laura.
Hi, María. Yes, I mean, thank you. It was such a great piece of work. I mean, I congratulate you. So one thing, so I have one big comment. So I was missing a lot about the setting. That is, I think that's part of the story that you didn't have the time to cover today, but I think it will help you to answer the questions that maybe Martin was raising today. So my question, it was more about why these female migrants end up in these locations, and this is connected with there might be some issues connected with the selection of the destination. So just highlighting few points, even if you don't have that much time, that would be important just to mention briefly. And in that regard, I think that the results are extremely convincing, so I really like it. But just to provide further evidence on the results, I was thinking about this reform in Spain, where there was this change in the social security, where they incorporated the reporting and the inclusion of the domestic services into the social security. So you could exploit this variation, this policy. I don't remember when it was, but you could exploit the fact of before and after, and this could be an increase or a change in the cost that could give you some further evidence. And yes, and the other comments I will forward to you. Yeah.
Great. Thanks a lot, Laura. Yeah, I mean, indeed, I've got a lot of stuff, but it's part of the setting, and it's actually part of explaining why the shift share might actually work in this setting, and why one can assume exogeneity of the shares, in the sense that many people came not just looking for what's the best labor market outcome, but for instance, Moroccans were locating in terms of geographical proximity, so they were mostly in the south. Then people from South America had mostly family links, so many of them were also in places like Galicia and in the Canary Islands, because that's where they had. These were like centers of a lot of people from Spain actually migrated in the early 19th century to Latin America. And then for Romanians, you also have a lot of religion links. So, I mean, there are reasons beyond economic conditions that might drive the locations. And I agree that this is important to highlight. And then in terms of the domestic in the social security, yes, I mean, like in the data set, they almost, I mean, I cannot yet see the category. So I think they did it later. And then the other thing is that, I mean, they were registered, but as long as people would formally employ them. But I think that was actually, during the boom. I don't see them in the data, but I can further explore that, because I think it matters also in terms of prices, let's say, because then it was like compulsory in theory to affiliate, I mean, to legalize this legally employed, let's say, these workers. And then I just remember that Emir also mentioned in terms of the drop in prices, if I can document that. I have like some, I mean, this is just descriptive evidence. There's some stuff from the expenditure survey. The only thing is that one is at the autonomous community. So it's like very, very, very coarse, very wide, like it's like 18 regions. But I can check that, and I can include it either just descriptively or in a properly estimate, let's say, if there's a drop in the costs.